And so I think that he knew he was going to invade Ukraine or something like that 10 years ago. He knew that the leverage we had over him was his foreign money. And that was one of the reasons why he's chased me around the world, trying to invest in every different place, death threats, etc., and meddling in all sorts of other political processes, because he was afraid that this is the one place where we have leverage over him.
Bill Browder. Bill Browder was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005 as the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. But more recently, he's been described as Vladimir Putin's number one enemy. Since the murder of the anti-corruption lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was working for Browder, my guest's advocacy has led to the passage of the Magnitsky Act in 34 countries. These are laws that can be used to sanction human rights abusers and kleptocrats around the world. And following his bestseller Red Notice, he has now written Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath, which is his thrilling account of being targeted by Putin for exposing a campaign to steal and launder hundreds of billions of dollars and eliminate those who stood in the way. Freezing Order is out now, and Bill Browder is with me now. Welcome to the program, Bill Browder.
Great to be here.
Thanks very much for being with us. Look, I know this, a lot of people have said this book reads like a thriller, and indeed it does. I know this is real life rather than a thriller, but set the scene for us. Where are we at the start of Freezing Order? What's going on?
Well, the first chapter it takes us to Madrid. I was invited by the chief anti-corruption prosecutor of Spain to come in and give evidence, formal evidence, about dirty Russian money connected to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky that had ended up in luxury properties on the coast of Spain. So I show up in Madrid, I check into my hotel, and the next morning, as I'm leaving my room to go to the meeting with this prosecutor, there are two very large Spanish policemen standing outside the door of my hotel room. And they ask me for my ID, and I say, "What are you here for?" And they say, "Interpol, Russia." So I basically was being arrested by one branch of the Spanish police while I was going to another branch of the Spanish police to give evidence. And the people who had organized my arrest were the people I was giving evidence against, which corrupt Russian officials. I mean, it couldn't have been more absurd. I mean, thankfully, I have Twitter. I tweeted out that I was being arrested. By the time I got to the police station, I have got a lot of followers. 50 journalists had called Interpol, 50 more had called the Spanish Interior Ministry, and it was a complete mess up on their part, and they eventually released me. But this is my life. I mean, This is what happens, and it has been happening over and over the last 10 years. If you go after Putin's money, they come after you anywhere in the world.
Well, I mean, this is a sort of a small taste of the persecution you've been facing. We'll come to that in a minute. But this book, the bulk of this book, it's about how global money laundering works, right, and the corruption that facilitates it.
Yeah. So basically, we said to ourselves, so Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, was murdered because he uncovered a $230 million corruption scheme. And after he was murdered, I said, we have to get justice for him. Who got that $230 million? And so the book is all about this long, hard process over a 10-year period of tracing the money and all the places we found it and all the things that the Russians have done to try to stop us from finding it. But basically, the bottom line is that every crime that's committed in Russia, Putin gets a cut, including this one, and we could prove it. And this crime was one of literally 1,000 similar crimes. And the total amount of money stolen that we were able to identify, and this is just what we could identify, coming out of Russia by the Putin regime, was $230 billion just from this one set of data and facts. And so my estimate is that Putin and his cronies, about 1,000 people, over a 22-year period, have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state. $1 trillion. So that's 1,000 billion.
So I mean, when you talk about Putin and his cronies, I mean, there's a lot you say in this book about what can be traced to Putin. Where's the line for you about what's plausible speculation and what is established fact about how much of this goes right back to Putin and indeed Putin's own pocket?
Well, so what we were able to do is trace. So there was a big expose a few years back called the Panama Papers. Most people probably remember the name. It was there was a Panamanian law firm. All their documents got leaked, and in every country there was a hero or an anti-hero, I should say. And Russia's anti-hero was this guy who was a cellist from St. Petersburg. His name was Sergei Roldugin. And what the Panama Papers showed was that this Sergei Roldugin, this cellist, had accumulated $2 billion from Russian oligarchs, Russian state banks, and other institutions. And then and so that makes him the richest musician in the world and the richest cellist in the world by a factor of 150 times. The next richest cellist is Yo-Yo Ma. And so the obvious question, why is this cellist getting all this money? And the answer is, this particular cellist is Putin's best friend from childhood. He's the godfather of Putin's daughter. He was the one who introduced Putin to his first wife, and he was a nominee for Vladimir Putin. And that is speculation. There's no document that proves that. But I think everybody in the world, including all governments who have sanctioned this Roldugin, have come to accept Roldugin as being a nominee for Vladimir Putin. In other words, up front, a trustee, someone who Putin trusts to hold his money.
Yeah.
And we were able to prove that Sergei Roldugin was a recipient of some of the money from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over.
Yeah, and so I mean, as you say, it's a lot for a cellist. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin and his motivation. In your perspective, is he amassing money and wealth because he's in charge of Russia and he can, or is the money and wealth really just the primary motivation there, like more than the glory of Russia that we often suggest he's obsessed by as well? Is it really all about the money for him?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. There's so many people that think that Putin is some type of patriot, that he's that he's trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, as using your words, glory of Russia. That's just not the case. So everybody who goes into government in Russia not to serve the country, but to steal money. And this is like a well-known, highly accepted fact for anybody who's in any way close to what goes on in Russia. The higher you are in government, the more money you're able to steal. And if you're the president, you get to steal the most money. And it's just how it works over there. And so, coming back to this $1 trillion number, there is no possibility that anyone can describe Vladimir Putin as a patriot or as any type of person for the glory of Russia if he and his cronies are ready to completely and absolutely drain out all financial resources from the country, so they can't do anything. They have no, the hospitals are empty with machinery. The schools don't have anything. That they don't fill the potholes in the roads. And we've seen it with our own eyes in this war, where all the gas was stolen out of the gas tanks of these tanks, and so they ran out of gas on the way into Ukraine in the military. They sold the spare parts of the airplanes, so they can't use them as bombers. The whole place is hollowed out, and that is very much explains everything about what's going on in Russia. Why did Putin start this war? He started this war because he was worried about people who had watched him steal for 22 years, the Russian people, not want him to be in power anymore. He was doing this to deflect their anger towards a foreign enemy. And this is a very common strategy for dictators. Start a war if you're worried about your people rising up.
Did you yourself, while working in Russia and with Russia, did you have an epiphany about all this, or was it something that you were always vaguely aware of about the nature of the kind of the state you were dealing with?
Well, there was always this thing that there's an expression, bad boyar, good czar, which the boyars were the sort of in the history and the oligarchs during the czarist era. And we all kind of fell into that trap a little bit, thinking, well, there's all these corrupt people, but Putin is really, this is the early days, but Putin is really trying to, make it a better place. And it's just a hard place to manage with all this corruption. But for me, the epiphany was the case of Sergei Magnitsky.
Yeah.
Sergei uncovered a $230 million government corruption scheme, and he testified about it. And he should have been patted on the back and rewarded and given a trophy for uncovering government corruption and identifying it. But instead, he was arrested, tortured, and killed. And Putin got involved in the cover-up and giving then state honors to the people who killed him. And then, worst of all, presiding over a prosecution of Sergei Magnitsky 3 years after they killed him, in the first ever prosecution of a dead man in the history of Russia. And this case by itself, what for me was the absolute proof that Putin is a crook. He's a criminal. And that his regime is a criminal regime.
You write that the Magnitsky Act was central to Russia's interference in the 2016 election, and basically, why they were keen on Donald Trump, because they hoped he could do something about it. And indeed, Putin himself asked Trump to facilitate your being deported at one point as well. Do you think the Magnitsky Act has led to further sort of meddling by Russia in Western democracies because they're so desperate to overturn these acts?
Well, so the Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation that freezes the assets and bans the visas of kleptocrats and human rights violators. Started with Russia, but applies all over the world. And Putin absolutely hated it. Starting back in 2012, when it was passed, he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to try to repeal it. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families in retaliation. He sent his own emissary to Trump Tower to try to convince them. And he did this same type of thing all over the world. And he knew back then, I think, that he was going to do something so outrageous like what he's doing right now. And he understood that if this legislation existed everywhere, then this would be one of the tools used to go after all of his foreign money while he was doing something outrageous. And so I think that he knew he was going to invade Ukraine or something like that 10 years ago. He knew that the leverage we had over him was his foreign money, and that was one of the reasons why he's chased me around the world, trying to invest in every different place, death threats, etc., and meddling in all sorts of other political processes, because he was afraid that this is the one place where we have leverage over him.
Well, I mean, so the implication of what you're saying is that the right kind of sanctions, sanctions targeted on individuals like Putin and those around him, really are our best lever, right?
Well, they're not they're one of our best levers. I mean, if we had used the Magnitsky Act or similar types of individual sanctions before the war had started, so that Putin could see that we were actually gonna do it, and we wouldn't have to do it for all 118 oligarchs. We could have done 5 oligarchs before the war, and sent a message to Putin that we're. And by the way, the oligarchs are the ones who hold his money. If we had sent this message to him before the war, there might have been a totally different calculation about how he went about things. Putin was convinced that we weren't going to do anything like this, and he was not wrong to think that, because for the last 22 years, every time he's committed an atrocity, we haven't used these tools. We've sort of, we want to be seen to be doing something without doing anything. We kick out a bunch of diplomats and then they replace them with new diplomats. Putin had a good reason to think that nothing was going to happen. And so when he went ahead thinking that we were all just a bunch of narrow-minded, greedy people that wouldn't do anything, and then all of a sudden, he miscalculated and we miscalculated. We should have done something. One
of our listeners asked before this interview began whether there is such a thing as a good Russian oligarch, or if anybody who has amassed wealth in Russia is by definition complicit with the state. There are oligarchs who consider themselves enemies of Putin, right?
Well, I think that there's a good litmus test of a good oligarch versus a bad oligarch. Are they ready to condemn Putin right now, this minute, for being a war criminal and killing innocent civilians in Ukraine? If they can go out and use the word Putin criminal war, that's the litmus test. And it's very interesting to watch these people all trying to thread this needle, saying we object to violence. We don't think that conflict is good. It's terrible when people are fighting with each other. That's not a condemnation of Putin. And for what it's worth, you can't be rich in Russia unless you're doing so with the permission of Putin, and with Putin getting a big cut, a 50% cut. And so it's very, I think 1 or 2 oligarchs are good, and there's 118 of them in total, and probably 116 of them are all complicit.
Wow. Yeah, well, look, that's fascinating story, fascinating tale, fascinating book. That is Bill Browder. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Bill Browder. And a Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath is out now.